There are unintended consequences for government intervention into housing markets, and the eviction moratorium proves that point. I'm Tony, and this is Real Estate Investing and Landlord News. Alright, so I have an interesting article for you today, and it's going over some of the unintended consequences of the government intrusion into the housing market. And this article is pretty interesting because it actually goes over some comments that the former sidekick to Conan O'Brien said recently. And he was looking for an apartment for rent for his son when he went away to college, and they were having a little bit of trouble finding one. So yeah, interesting article right there. But before I get into the article, go ahead, hit the like and subscribe button. Maybe leave a comment down below and let me know other unintended consequences that you've observed about, the housing market since they implemented those eviction moratoriums and really, screwed landlords over. Okay, so this article comes from fee.org and it says, Conan O'Brien's sidekick accidentally exposes unintended consequences of government intervention in housing markets. Let's see what it says. Those who promote government intervention in the economy often have good intentions. But as economist Thomas Sowell quipped in his best-selling book, Basic Economics, nothing is easier than to have good intentions, but without an understanding of how an economy works, good intentions can lead to disastrous consequences for a whole nation. And that describes right there the eviction moratorium, okay? I honestly don't believe that the majority of the politicians who put that into place thought that it was going to end up, just screwing people over. I think they had good intentions. They were like, oh, we're going to help keep these tenants in these properties, but they didn't even think very far ahead and think about the fact that, hey, landlords are the ones who are really going to suffer with an eviction moratorium, okay? Comedian and Conan O'Brien's former sidekick, Andy Richter, recently provided a valuable lesson in unintended consequences on Twitter when he complained about a request that a landlord made of him while looking for an apartment for his college-aged son. In a now deleted tweet, he wrote, "My son is looking for a studio apartment around USC. And one that he applied for a couple of days ago told us that the owner wants 6 months rent up front after he and I both paid app fees. No wonder people effing hate landlords and the management companies that facilitate them." This tweet came just one day after the Supreme Court struck down the CDC's eviction moratorium, a policy that Richter says, yes, I am completely in favor of. The irony must have been lost on him that the policy he supports was most likely behind the landlord's request. Yeah, and the author of this article is absolutely correct, okay? So think about it, okay? When you're talking about USC, that's University of Southern California. So we're talking about his son was looking for a place to rent in California. I'm sure the area around USC is particularly expensive because there's a lot of students looking for places around there, and the landlord already knows that, hey, with all the eviction moratoriums in place, with all the other tenant protections and everything in place, we have to charge sky high rents just in case this tenant decides to stop paying. We have to ask for 6 months rent in advance because this tenant could stop paying and I could be completely cut off from any money whatsoever, and I have no way to get rid of them. If I do need to evict this tenant, it could take 6 months plus, even after the eviction moratorium ends, to get them out of my property. So, yeah, the rules they put in place are the very ones that have caused all of these things to happen. So when this Andy Richter, when he says that he supports these eviction moratoriums and tenant rights stuff, well, he's actually supporting the very policies that make it so hard for his son to actually find a place to rent. Why would a landlord make such a request? For anyone trying to rent an apartment, hearing that the owner of the building wants 6 months rent up front would understandably cause frustration. This is doubly true if you simply don't have the money to pay it up front, and that cost is prohibitive. Given that the average rent is $1,124, we're talking about $6,744 paid up front. How many Americans can afford that? Not many, although Richter probably can. Indeed, some surveys show nearly 70% of Americans have less than $1,000 in savings. This is undoubtedly a problem. However, in order to see where the blame should be directed, it is important to understand why a landlord may have made that request in the first place. And I believe they're going to go over some of the reasons why right now, and it's some of the stuff that I just went over. Under the eviction moratorium, each new renter posed a huge financial risk to the property owner. Under normal circumstances, a tenant would agree to pay rent to the landlord in exchange for the use of the landlord's private property. If either side violated the agreement, it would become void. But under an eviction moratorium, the tenant, in many cases, has no obligation to live up to his end of the bargain, and the landlord has no ability to enforce it. In other words, it creates a scenario where if the renter fails to pay rent, then the landlord may be on the hook for housing them for free at a significant financial loss. The worst possibility for a landlord is not if someone does not pay rent, rather, is if they are unable to replace the person who refuses to pay rent with someone who will. In that case, landlords are essentially paying for other people to occupy and use their private property. And that's exactly what the eviction moratorium caused. They caused a situation where not where they're worried about the tenant not paying rent. Well, now they are unable to put a tenant in there who is paying rent, okay? So they're unable to get any compensation whatsoever for these tenants. And in a lot of cases, they weren't even eligible for the rental assistance program, or the tenants were actively not participating in the rental assistance program. So these landlords got screwed over bad. And right before, as soon as the eviction moratorium ended in a lot of places, you know what tenants started doing? Then they started applying for rental assistance. So after you have not paid your landlord for 18 plus months, well, now I need some help. Well, maybe you should have thought about what the landlord was going through, but nobody ever does, okay? And that's my biggest gripe. I'm going to just keep beating this horse, and just get it into the skulls of everybody who's watching this. Hopefully there's somebody of influence up there that will be able to see that landlords were the ones who suffered the most through this pandemic, okay? You're taking the financial losses of the tenants and then you're throwing them on top of us, the landlords. The reason a landlord may ask for 6 months of rent up front is in order to mitigate this risk. He is using this enhanced deposit as a type of insurance policy so that his income is secure for the foreseeable future. After all, the government has already shown that it is eager and willing to implement eviction moratoria. And if the landlord does not wish to risk his income vanishing one day, a completely reasonable wish, then asking for 6 months of rent up front is a sensible thing to do. This predicament is even better understood when one considers the fact that the eviction moratorium has put numerous small landlords in financial ruins and even left an Air Force veteran homeless. I actually covered that in a different one of my videos, okay? So, yeah, up in New York State, there was a landlord and she ended up homeless because she wanted to move back into the property and she couldn't get that tenant out of there. So, yeah, don't think that all landlords are these super rich, super wealthy people. We're just normal people just trying to get by. And when they put these eviction moratorium in place, they are really hurting us financially, especially the small landlords, okay, with just a few properties. The popular perception of landlords as real estate tycoons is far removed from reality. There are over 22.5 million rental units owned by mom and pop landlords, which is nearly the same number as are owned by businesses. These mom and pop landlords, who are normal, everyday people just trying to make a living, own on average just 2 rental units. Moreover, among these individual landlords, more than half of them did not even originally buy the property in order to rent it out and profit off of it, but rather just to use it as their residence. It is a sad reality that the government has put these landlords in a position where they have few other options for the sake of their families to take measures that mitigate their risk, okay? So what this all really just comes down to is that the landlords, we have to mitigate risk, okay? And The unintended consequence that was caused by all this is that it is hard as heck for tenants to find properties to rent. And they have to come up with tons of cash, including, in this case, up to 6 months of rent in advance in order to move into a property. And that's exactly what's going to happen. Landlords are going to raise their rent to higher levels to cover all the losses that they might have to accept. So low-income tenants, all tenants are going to suffer because of these eviction moratoriums. And this is not anything that's surprising to me or to any of the other landlords out there, because we're the ones who, basically suffered throughout the entire pandemic, and now we're just trying to mitigate our risk.